The 1970s were an interesting time for MCC, as several small, humbly beginning projects turned out to have global impact. I think of some early incidents with victims and offenders that contributed to the restorative justice movement. I think of a few women gathering to sell some used clothing that became a multi-million-dollar thrift store movement. I love the story of the prairie farmers bringing their grain together as a generous response to world hunger, never knowing that they were beginning the Canadian Food Grains Bank, now this collaborative project of 15 different national church bodies across Canada saying, we want to respond to hunger across the world. I'm so grateful for supporters that allow us to respond to disasters like Hurricane Mitch in Central America and the horrific earthquake that hit Haiti in 2010. There are also disasters that are caused by human conflict and violence, like the war in Syria. I think, of course, of the welcoming of the so-called boat people after the war in Vietnam that became the private sponsorship of refugee program here in Canada.
The private sponsorship program was started by the church. Volunteers and faith communities who said yes to resettling strangers who they had never met before.
In many ways, MCC's history, its whole century, is the history of this great arc of people being displaced and a community saying, God calls us to welcome the stranger.
The average time that a refugee spends in a refugee camp is 15 years. Why are there generations of refugees being born and raised in refugee camps? What needs to be done to address the root causes of forced migration? These are questions that MCC is asking itself as it does its work with its local partners on the ground, responding to the immediate relief needs and looking at refugee resettlement, which we recognize is not a solution to the root causes of forced migration, but it is an important piece of this puzzle because it ultimately saves lives. What was started in Canada by a small group of volunteers is now being held up as a model for the world to replicate. And I think that is an example of the ripples of what it looks like to choose welcome.
There were still very practical ways in which MCC could demonstrate peace building in its own backyard in ways that often lend integrity to the work that we do internationally. And a huge part of that is our commitment to just and reconciled relationships with First People, with Indigenous communities. I remember seeing a very grainy, almost homemade video showing low-level military jets flying over Labrador. And then, not very many weeks later, getting a call from MCC, would you and your family consider going and living in this community at the invitation of this Innu community called Sheshajit to work with them in resistance to what was becoming a much more heavily militarization of their homeland. Now when I look back, I'm struck that a lot of this was about relationships across lines that had been deeply divided for centuries.
Now because you're using too much.
I continue to love that Louise and I and our family can go back and visit house to house. 30 plus years later, there are relationships that are partly, yes, between the community and MCC, but they're between families and our family. That's a treasure that I'll always keep with me.
I think in a world where we are living in such polarized times, we need a people to rise up who are committed to seeking that common ground, who are committed to staying at the table, because that's what peace building looks like in practice.